on with life. Well, joining me is somebody who is going to rebel against his party again tomorrow. And this time, well, I say that, David Davis, MP for Halton, Price and Howden, because, you know, you've spent a lot of years in the House of Commons loyally supporting the Conservative Party and holding very senior ministerial positions, and you kind of rebelled on some civil liberties issues.
Some big issues, yeah.
Over the years, and, of course, Brexit, with a pretty big fallout with Mrs May.
Yeah, just a bit.
But now this is actually, and taking Brexit out, you know, and those crushing defeats that May had for the so-called deal, what we're gearing up for tomorrow potentially is a very large rebellion against government policy, which is basically the one that matters, I think, is to introduce vaccine passports for people to go to nightclubs or major sporting events or big crowded venues. And we've got a Prime Minister that believes it's the right thing to do. We've got a European continent that's put it in place. We've seen Sir Keir Starmer tonight, who absolutely supports it. So, David Davis, why are you and the rebels right and everybody else wrong?
Well, you've almost explained it. I mean, the rest of Europe doing it and it's failing. I mean, it is. If you look, it's failing everywhere else.
But vaccine passports, I mean, the argument that's given is it's going to make people safer.
Yeah, and that's just plumb wrong. That's just plumb wrong. I mean, the first thing to understand is we're both old enough to have had the old traditional vaccines. You know, TB, polio, all those vaccines. Right. What do? They stop the disease dead. You don't catch it at all. These modern vaccines, more often than not, stop the symptoms primarily, but don't stop you catching the disease. They reduce it a bit, although that wanes over time, but they don't actually stop you catching the disease. So after about 12 weeks, actually, you are if you're vaccinated like me, I'm treble vaccinated.
Right.
Yeah, you are as likely to infect somebody as an unvaccinated person. That's what the odds are. Now, what we doing? What's the government doing? It's saying, well, you know, in circumstances where you might get a super spreader event, that's what they're worried about, you know, big football matches, as happened in the past in this crisis, then we're going to use vaccines to prevent that happening. It won't work. It simply won't work because, you know, you've got a very sizable chance of infecting somebody if you are vaccinated. If your vaccination is primarily for yourself. My vaccinations mean I got a 90% lower chance of having to go to hospital if I get the disease. Nearly 100% elimination of the death risk for someone in my category. So, you know, this is a misunderstanding of how the vaccines work.
So would it be safer? OK, I mean, I'm just taking the logic of your argument that you can catch and carry the vaccine regardless whether you've been vaccinated or not.
Yeah.
So if I was going to a big sporting event or going to a nightclub, might it be safer for the venue not to ask for a vaccine passport, but to ask for a lateral flow test that was conducted that day?
Exactly. And in fact, I mean, in my own, I mean, I travel. I'm the classical vector of this disease. You know, I come from this place here, this sort of
and you're back to Yorkshire.
10 million people all together.
Yeah.
I'm in the busiest part of it in many ways. International travellers coming in and out of Whitehall. You know, I'm the absolute classic vector. And I go back to nice, quiet East Yorkshire.
Yeah.
You've been there.
Yeah.
And suddenly I appear in a meeting. Well, I'm the risk factor here. So what do I do? I went to a funeral on Friday. Before I went, I had a lateral flow test. On Saturday morning, I had a party meeting. Before I did it, I had a lateral flow test. And if I hadn't done it for that, I'd have done it before I went to see my family.
Yeah.
Because the lateral flow test is what gives you... And, of course, that doesn't impinge on people's liberties. You know, you want to go to a match, you buy a ticket. Well, if you like, part of the buying the ticket is having a lateral flow test. It's not requiring...
So regular lateral flow testing might actually be safer.
Much so. Oh, no might.
Having a QR code on your phone.
There is no might about it. It's definitely safer.
Okay.
That's the question. There used to be worries about lateral flow tests, but what they realised at one point was what it was really measuring was the viral load. In other words, your infectiousness, exactly the same thing. And it's not just true for vaccine passports. The other vote we're going to have tomorrow is on mandating people to have vaccines if they're doctors, as they already have done, for care workers. We've lost 30,000 care workers from an industry which we need to work flat out to clear the hospitals. We're going to lose 70,000 people out of the healthcare sector. You know, much better to have lateral flow tests because they work better, but also it doesn't drive people out of the industry you need to make work.
And yet, we've seen Keir Starmer tonight. I mean, it really was just Boris Johnson with a better haircut. It was all the same.
Well, with a haircut.
Well, or a little comb. But, yeah, I mean, he didn't go as far as Boris and use the word emergency, but it was all, protect the NHS, save lives, get boosted, etc. So there's little doubt that these measures that you're concerned about, that you oppose, will pass
they'll
in
pass.
the Commons tomorrow. Now, one of your co-rebels, Mr. Fish from the West Country, has gone a bit too far, I think, and described vaccine passports as like living in Nazi Germany. Yeah. I think that's over the top and probably damages, actually, the cause.
Yes, it does.
I think that you're trying to fight for. Yeah. But seriously, how many MPs are on the verge of rebelling over this?
Well, we think it's going to be a record rebellion, so probably 60 or more, but I don't know how many. Yeah. Well, there's a lot of pressure coming on people. I mean, I talked to one or two of the younger MPs over the weekend, and both of them had calls both from the Whip's office and from Number 10. I mean, that's how seriously they're taking it. So there'll be a lot of pressure on people. But, I mean, you're right, that is overstating. I mean, bear in mind, earlier on in this crisis, I have gone along with things that naturally you would expect me to rebel over. On the basis none of us knew, right? Now we're 2 years in. We know some things about it. There are lots we don't know. We actually don't know if it's an emergency, by the way. We don't know. We don't know what the range.
Look at the evidence from South Africa, and that South African doctor that I had on, and she rather sarcastically said, "Well, maybe you've got a different variant to us." No, we've got the South African variant.
I mean, the real problem with taking the South African example is it's a different country to us.
And they've got a younger population. I get that.
But it goes all sorts of different ways. Younger population. Yeah. It's sort of their summer. It's more of them, less of them vaccinated, but more of them being infected. So you've got all sorts of differences. But what you can do is compare South Africa under Delta and South Africa under Omicron. Under the earlier waves, you had many more people go to hospital, or have to go to hospital. But also it's an interesting difference. The wave of this wave, those of this wave who've gone into hospital, only 10% need oxygen. 100% for the first two waves.
Yeah, and she made that point. Yeah,
did she?
Oxygen wasn't needed. And yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It is. I mean, clearly, this is a political move. Now, you've been in the House of Commons since the days of Margaret Thatcher.
And since God was a boy.
Well, I mean,
He was probably in her cabinet.
But you've been there since 87.
Yeah.
You've watched Conservative leaders, and Labour leaders indeed, you've watched them wax and wane. Yeah. How much trouble is Boris in?
Immediately less than people think. Because, there are various things this week. We've got the battle tomorrow, which he'll win. It's just a question of the size of the rebellion. Yeah. You've got the by-election on Thursday.
Shropshire. Yeah.
Which I think is a toss of a coin, how that's going to go, frankly. You've got various other issues relating to parties and other number 10 issues, if you like. But the truth is, the end of the week's the end of Parliament. We're then gone for 3 weeks.
Which means this Saturday he could announce a whole raft of new restrictive measures.
He could do.
And you guys wouldn't even get to debate.
He could do. I don't think he'd be quite in that confident position by Saturday. But the point being, anyway, the point I was going to make is this. Up until now, people say to you, this crisis, different rules for Boris. This crisis, it's priced in. This crisis, Boris has got out of worse. Yeah. Right? I think that sort of Teflon coat has come off. And I think that's the issue. I think Boris has to think very hard now about who he's got in Number 10. Number 10 isn't working properly, Who he's got around him, who his advisors are, who's his Willie Whitelaw, who's his
Harry.
I'll leave that to you to comment on. But the truth is that the next crisis that comes will be the one that's really worrying, and the one after that in the new. And there will be more. There always are. Yeah. There always are.
Yeah. Well,
and he will be at risk, and we will be at risk. Think about it. Normally leaders are more popular than their parties, and we depend on that as part of the dynamic of politics. If that turns around, then we'll be in an uncomfortable position.